You want to do some quick intro?
Yeah, I'll do just a little quick intro. So hi everyone, we're from the Asia Group and the Asia Group Foundation. So I'm Grace Riley Adams. I'm a program officer at the Asia Group Foundation. We're a nonprofit in Northwest DC. We partner with about 20 to 25 nonprofit organizations throughout DC and Asia, largely focused on women's empowerment and youth education. So we've partnered with NAUDL and WDL for the last 4 years or so on various topics. A few years ago it was the US-China topic, which was right in our wheelhouse, and then with immigration last year, and this year with arms sales. So the way our organization works is we have two different sides. So we have one is the Asia Group, which is a consulting firm. We help large companies that want to launch or expand in Asia. And some of our clients include the defense sector. So we, Trey and Greg are part of our defense team on the consulting side and come with a lot of experience both in the public and private sector working on defense issues. So we'll be talking with you today about the small arms topic and U.S. defense interests kind of in the global arena and why weapon sales are an important, kind of the important role they play for the U.S. And then we have the foundation as well. So I'll leave it to Trey and Greg to give their brief bios as well, and then we can get started with the discussion. We have about a 20 or 30 minute discussion planned, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. But I know you all have been already working on the topic for a few days now, so if you have questions throughout, please feel free to jump in. And don't mind me, I'll be taking a few photos around the room, so yeah, just let me know.
Morning, great to see bright shiny faces and everything. Appreciate you all participating. I've heard a very successful program here, so we wish you all the best in the future and hope that we can help work that. Trey Meeks, retired colonel from the United States Air Force, so I did about 30 years, came from a little small town in Missouri, went to the Air Force Academy out in Colorado Springs, and then had a great career in the Air Force. That was capped off. My last two assignments were in Special Operations Command Pacific, where we dealt with a lot of small arms issues and arming, more small arms, I guess, and arming like-minded partners, and we would execute things by, with, and through them to help achieve their objectives and our objectives, in a given scenario. Additionally, after that, I then went to Singapore, where I was the Office of Defense Cooperation. So heavy-duty arms sales there. The ambassador often called me his merchant of death. So you can either not embrace that or you can embrace that. So obviously very joking there, but at the same time, that was something that people look at. And for us in the United States, our arms sales are a huge element to how we work with national, to help our national interest in other countries. Again, by, with, and through, our partners to help make that happen. Greg, a little bit.
How you guys all doing this morning? So my name is Greg Chaffin. I been now down in Washington for about 10 years now. I'm originally from Portland, Oregon. Came down to Washington and started working in think tank world. Moved into the Department of Defense, where I spent a couple of years, most recently as the Chief of Staff in the Asia Pacific Security Affairs Office in the Office of Secretary of Defense. My office essentially ran the entirety of U.S. defense policy for Afghanistan through Japan, up to Mongolia, down to Australia. So roughly a third of the world and about half its population. A lot of hot spots in there, so China, North Korea, Afghanistan obviously, India, fun stuff going on. So I joined the Asia Group about 6 months ago, jumping back into the private sector. And now where we help defense firms, do business in the Asia Pacific region as well as with the U.S. Military. So, just a little background on myself, and looking forward to the conversation this morning.
So I'll jump in on the topic of arms sales. So numerous misconceptions about that topic. So I talked about the fact that I was in the United States Air Force for 30 years. You know, I worked in 2 joint jobs. So these are places where under U.S. Pacific Command, we kind of come together. So it's Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, all working together as one big team, again, enabling U.S. interest. So just out of curiosity, when you think arms sales, who do you think controls the release of arms sales? And so I'll give you the Department of Justice, I'll give you the Department of Commerce, I'll give you the Department of State, and I'll give you the Department of Defense. So how many vote for Department of Defense? Okay. Anybody? Department of State? Okay. Fairly educated crowd. Department of Commerce? Okay. So not bad at all. So anyway, Department of Justice. Okay, that's a very, very new one under this administration, but I won't go too far into that. I'll talk about how things are supposed to work and how things do work. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what right looks like. So then you can see how, you know, the arms sales can very much be a force for good and stability and security and prosperity around the world if they're utilized correctly. If they're not, then things don't go quite as well. So with that, so the Department of Defense was a very good input. The Department of Defense controls many, many aspects of this. So with me being the Office of Defense Cooperation, I am the face of all this. So when people have an arms sale issue, they largely are coming to me. When we have a partnership issue, again, they're largely coming to me. That being said, all arms sales are an instrument of, you know, foreign diplomacy. So it's the Department of State that controls the vast majority. And so there's a delineation where when we do major defense equipment, the Department of State controls all that. There are certain things that, and we keep kind of adding to the list, which don't count as major defense equipment. We take those off the United States munitions list and we give those to the Department of Commerce. And it looks a little bit more like trading shampoo and diapers and other things. And the controls are much, much less. We still have controls though. Don't get me wrong. We still have controls. Okay? So those are kind of the entities that really get to play in this. So where I came from, Singapore, okay, small Southeast Asian country, but to use a boxing analogy that commonly gets used with these guys, tiny little island, you know, that has 5 million people, but punches way above its weight class and has a long-term relationship with the United States. So they had F-15 fighters, they had F-16 fighters, Apache helicopters, Chinook helicopters. Singapore trains 1,000 people in the United States every year. So that is basically being here, training with us, not only that, but getting inculcated with our values. And so Singapore, very much a like-minded country in terms of how they see the world. And so anything we give Singapore is not only in our national interest, but also in their national interest. And those are shared interests. Very, very nice when those two things can come together. So that's what right looks like. So when we talk about, we're not out there, those F-15s, we kind of keep inventory of those. So we do checks. It's called in-use monitoring, okay? So we go out and like every single AMRAAM, does anybody know what an AMRAAM missile is? So it's an advanced medium-range air-to-air missile. So an extremely capable missile. So if I'm up in my F-15 and I want to shoot down a bad guy, basically I can shoot a lot longer than they can shoot at me. And you know what that means? That means we win that engagement. We do not like fair fights, okay? Fair fights are in nobody's interest, certainly not ours. So we want to have overwhelming military advantage because the best war is the war that never happens. If we can achieve, you know, a desirable end state without going to war, everybody, well, certainly we win. And in the end, probably that local population wins as well. We are not perfect in the United States. You will hear terms, people will talk about us being a hegemon and things like that and imposing our values worldwide. But as many people have put it, we are the most benevolent hegemon in the history of the world. Most people coming in did not look out for your best interests nearly to the same level that we did. So when you hear about the rise of China, you know, and half a billion people being brought out of poverty, largely enabled by the United States. We largely made China by making them the manufacturing base of the world. Another conversation, but nonetheless, when you look at the arms sales again, so all those things we do, when we look at whether we're going to sell F-15 fighter jets, or in this case, the next generation of F-35 fighter jets to Singapore, we look at those from number one, it has to be in our interest. So that is above and beyond, that's the number one thing. So as part of the embassy team, in an American embassy, you have a country team. So that is numerous people from the State Department, from the military, from organizations that can't really be talked about, to the Department of Commerce, to the FBI. The whole country team comes together supporting the ambassador. So when we look at making a foreign military sale, the country team, we do a country team assessment. It's written by the DoD guys, but it's supported by state and everybody else, okay? So when we look at it, we look at a few things. Number one, okay, is it in our best interest? So that's the number one thing. We don't sell these for no reason. We sell them because it's in our national interest. Generally, it also helps them out tremendously as well. There's also a thing called the Leahy Amendment, if any of you have ever heard of Senator Leahy. So Patrick Leahy, senator from Vermont, he put in a specific category that says, hey, these guys have to have a good human rights record. Because we don't just sell to anybody, we sell to people who aren't going to abuse our stuff and aren't going to use it for things that, you know, kind of ill purposes, if you will. So that's another one we look at. Additionally, is it going to kind of tilt the balance of power and potentially create instability in the region? So you can kind of imagine, you know, this is a little bit of an extreme, but you know, if we gave nuclear weapons to Singapore, obviously that would tilt the balance of power in a way that we don't want. That doesn't create stability. So one of the things we're really looking at is how to create stability. Remember, it's stability, it's security, it's prosperity, largely for all, and in many ways enabled by the United States. So those are the things we look at. So we send that, in this case, that'll get approved by the ambassador. So it's not a DoD guy just signing it off in isolation. It's approved by the ambassador level. It then goes to Pacific Command, so the command level. So we have a 4-star admiral or general who sits out in the Pacific Theater and looks at this from a much more regional perspective. Then it goes to the Department of State. Department of State will coordinate it amongst everybody, but the final decision is a State Department decision, okay? That's what right looks like. That is what, you know, a positive military sale and what it can do. So when we give things to, or when we sell things to Japan and Korea and to Singapore and places like that, it's very, very clear, it's in our national interest, increases stability and prosperity. You get into different scenarios that we've seen lately. What about Saudi Arabia? What about the UAE? What about supporting the war in Yemen? It gets much more gray there. And you've seen where those normal processes that I just talked about, those have largely been sidetracked. And so that's some of the things that I'm sure you guys are debating at this point in time. Additionally, what you've seen, we talked about all these major defense, you know, things. A lot of things moved to the Department of Commerce. Some of the things that have moved very recently are small arms. So I would kind of use the case of Singapore again. In Singapore, there really aren't any guns, and there really isn't any violence. So my 14-year-old daughter in Singapore could get on a subway, go around a city of 6 million people, and be completely safe at all times, and feel completely safe at all times. And the only few guns, most of the policemen are unmarked. The few guns that you do see are owned by, you know, some of those policemen, but often not in public view. A lot of cameras, though. Trust me on that one. It is a little bit of a surveillance state. But the real eye-opener with that is not just, you know, your 14-year-old daughter being able to be after midnight and you not being worried about her. But additionally, people would put preschool children in cabs and send them across town. So if you can imagine that, you know, just a very, very different world than where I grew up in Missouri and probably where you grew up, you know, in the broader DMV. So I highlight that, and so that's an example of potentially different ways to go about things, you know. If we dropped a whole bunch of guns into Singapore, would it make them safer? I kind of doubt it, you know, and I'm sure they would kind of doubt it. So the places where we are potentially selling these small arms, you have to remember too, our stuff is very, very expensive. The freedom fighter does not prefer a U.S. solution. The freedom fighter prefers an AK-47. It doesn't jam, the ammo is cheap, and anybody can operate one with very little training. So another really big thing to emphasize is we don't just sell weapons, we sell capabilities. So you've got to have a doctrine, you know. What am I going to do with this thing? You have to have an organization that actually supports what you're going to do with it. You have to have training, not just training for the guys operating the F-15, the maintainers. You need a supply chain to keep it all going. It is extremely complicated. And so what we've done, there's about 30 things you need in order to make sure that people have a capability. Because if that F-15 that you spent, $100 million on just rots out there on the ramp, on the tarmac at your airfield, we haven't really accomplished much of anything, have we? So you have to have leadership that supports it. You have to have the right spare parts and materials. You have to have all the infrastructure to support it. You have to have trained personnel. You have to have an education system that builds up to that. You have to have facilities. So as you can see, I've hit like 7 or 8 of them, but there's 30, different things that you have to have. So we don't just sell things and then not support them. There has to be a capability, a way to increase, somebody's capability. So that's what we do. When you compare, now we are now selling small arms. Again, most people are not going to want to buy our small arms because they're just not cheap enough, but you will see some of that. That is not really in our national interest to the same way that major defense sales are. So that's a completely different set of values that are being created there, but they're not our traditional values. So that is a deviation from what we've historically done with arms sales. And you got a question?
These major arms that we sell, are they like the latest technology that our military uses ourselves, or do we sell other countries arms as well, the same methods are?
So the question is, do we sell people the same quality of gear that we do? And in many cases, that is correct. So there's kind of a stair-step approach. Has anybody in this room ever heard of Five Eyes? Anybody ever heard of that? So it's largely an intelligence organization. So it's the UK, it's Australia, it's New Zealand, and it's Canada. So these are the more like-minded people with us. And so we generally share all our intelligence. But when it comes to arms sales, most of the time the Five Eyes get stuff very, very similar to what we have. In many cases, we will sell a previous generation. So I talked to you about the Amram Missiles. So this is an advanced medium-range air-to-air missile. So there's a version called the C7. Okay, so it can go out, whatever its classified distance is, and engage and defeat an enemy. We have only sold the D version of that, which can go a little bit further, can be a little more accurate to our closest allies. We also generally, NATO partners usually get the best stuff, as well as a lot of times Japan, Korea, even Singapore. But there's kind of a stair-step ladder to who gets what. But with that, I will turn it over to Greg. Greg's got a little more, my view is more the practitioner level from the region. Greg is one who's really seen this from the very strategic levels and can provide you that insight.
Thanks, Trey. Yeah, so jumping kind of on top of what Trey said, he mentioned that really the one of the core objectives of arms sales for the United States is to work by, with, and through our partners and allies. And tying that back into sort of U.S. strategic interests, when we think about selling major defense articles to partner countries, what we're really doing is looking to build up their capacity to, in many cases, address common challenges with us. So a great example would be selling helicopters to Southeast Asian countries. There's a lot of humanitarian assistance disaster relief missions that we do in Southeast Asia. There's a lot of, very recently there was typhoons that went right through there. And helicopters are one great asset that you can use to, bring in medical equipment, food, water to wrecked areas after, major storm systems move through and help people. So one of the things that we like to do is we like to, talk to our partners, see what their mission sets are, what their interests are, what their challenges are, and see how we can provide them with some assistance in terms of providing a capability that's needed for them that also suits sort of our interests. It's in our interest, for example, again in Southeast Asia, to make sure that folks there are able to look after their people, to provide them with the things that they need, because oftentimes what will happen is if they are essentially outclassed by whatever challenge they're facing, one of the first things they'll do is they'll turn to us and ask for our assistance, which can be expensive. We have resource limitations. There's time limitations because it takes, for example, if we're going to Southeast Asia again, it takes time for us to move a carrier battle group in there to provide helicopter lift to, or provide desalination, for example. But if they have that capability resident within, their country, then they can provide assistance and they can do the first responder kind of actions, and then we can provide support to them. So oftentimes when we're talking about those kind of, major defense articles, that's something that gets sort of lost in the mix. It's not so, a lot of times it's not necessarily the, you know, tip of the spear sort of, hey, we're going to go out and start bombing stuff. It's actually all of this capacity, all this capability that allows countries to better look after themselves, better take care of their people, better protect their own sovereignty, in ways that support our overarching interest in ensuring that there is, you know, sort of adherence to what we typically call sort of the liberal international order, which is one of rules and regulations and systems and checks. So again, when we sort of look at how broadly we how this fits into a national strategy. So one of the, you know, have any of you guys read the National Defense Strategy? It was published in 2016 or 2017. No, okay. But one of the main lines of effort in that national strategy is to strengthen our alliance relationships and look for new partnership opportunities. And again, this is primarily geared towards upholding sort of, you know, the open, liberal international order. So again, one where freedom of navigation, freedom of commerce, again, adherence to human rights is respected by all countries essentially. That doesn't mean that we're, you know, running around sort of necessarily acting as police state, as a police, the policing power in all circumstances. But what it does mean is that we're interested in building up the capabilities of like-minded partners. So again, like Five Eye countries, like, you know, Korea, Japan, NATO countries, again, countries across Southeast Asia, India, in the Middle East, to you know, essentially take on some of the responsibility for protecting what are commonly referred to as global or shared or common, you know, common interests in terms of, you know, maintaining open sea lanes, for example. So when we think about arms sales, that's usually the first lens through which we kind of view, from a strategic level, that we view that, you know, we come to approach that issue. How does this advance sort of, you know, the U.S. overarching strategic interest in terms of keeping and sustaining a liberal international order, advancing, you know, U.S. values, which again I think are fairly universal. How do we think about, you know, sort of ensuring that these capabilities help other countries sort of protect their own sovereignty, but are also not used in less good ways. Question.
Would you say that like selling arms in some instances breaks the U.S. strategic ambiguity or the gray line between like where we stand maybe in a conflict or relations?
It can. Yeah, it absolutely can. I mean, obviously, so there are obviously countries that we partner with directly, that we have treaty alliances with. So Japan, Korea, United Kingdom are examples of those. One sort of slightly more gray example is Israel. We don't have a formal treaty alliance with Israel, but political ties, people-to-people ties. We have a national policy, what's called the qualitative military edge, where we have basically decided that we will sell Israel our best, you know, essentially our best equipment or better equipment than we will sell to anyone else in the region. In that case, that has caused some friction with obviously some Middle Eastern partners. For example, Egypt for a long time was very suspicious of any arms sales to Israel. We have a similar type of relationship with Pakistan and India, whereby, you know, we have a very long-standing relationship, defense relationship with Pakistan. Obviously antagonistic towards India. We are now starting to move towards a more strategic partnership with India, who obviously doesn't like it when we sell major arms to Pakistan. And so I think certainly under the Obama administration and then under the Trump administration, you've seen sort of a rebalancing away from Pakistan and more towards India. So you could make the argument that, you know, and certainly the Pakistanis make this argument that that we're sort of realigning ourselves based on what we're, you know, based on the realities of what it is that we're selling or buying. I think if you were to talk to a policymaker like myself, I would say, if Pakistani interlocutor came to me and said, hey, are you aligning yourself with India more than you are with us? What I would say is, well, no, we're able to walk and chew gum at the same time. We're able to have a relationship with both, but we do need to balance our overarching strategic interests in both countries. And while that means maybe we're not going to sell Pakistan F-16s anymore, and we're looking to sell something similar to India, that doesn't mean that we will side with them in a war, for example, against Pakistan. But again, if you're Pakistani, you might not interpret that the same for obvious reasons, which, to be frank, they don't. But again, I think so. Actually, it's a really good question, because it does kind of get to the core of, I think, some of the things that you guys are talking about. In that, how do you make that decision if you're the United States about where to apply essentially a thumb to the scale? Because when you're providing U.S. arms from small to large to a particular country, as Trey mentioned, that does have the capacity to change the overarching balance of power within a particular, geographic region, or more broadly. And so these are the things that policymakers across the government really do have to grapple with. And that's one of the reasons why the State Department is actually in charge of a lot of the final release of a lot of this stuff, is because it has to conform with a broader understanding of our foreign policy interests with not just that country, but the region, and in terms of a global sort of strategic viewpoint. It's a very imperfect science, and it's not a science at all. Actually, it's a very perfect art. It's more, it's impressionist. It's not realist. And again, I think that's one of the important things about what you guys are doing, is you're having a conversation about, well, what's appropriate for us to do, what's not appropriate. I think, as Trey mentioned, in a lot of cases when we sell major arms to countries, there are a lot more. It's very difficult for someone. It would be very difficult for someone to transfer an F-16 or an F-15 fighter aircraft to a third country without us noticing, and we could very quickly put a stop to that. Totally different if you're transferring, a box of Stingers, which are shoulder-mounted, rocket-propelled grenade missile launchers, essentially, from country to country. So I'm sure, as you guys probably all know, that was a big problem in Afghanistan. When the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in the 80s and 90s, we provided a lot of small arms, including Stingers, to the Mujahideen, which then were the precursor to Al-Qaeda. And so again, these are some of the things that you have to, as you're sort of looking at this problem set within a holistic kind of foreign policy approach, you need to try and understand the second, third order effects of what it is that you're doing, and make the best judgment call that you can. But like I said, it's very imperfect. Another good example, and kind of going back to the small arms realm, that I would encourage you to look into, that is what's been going on in the Philippines. So a couple of years ago, there was a long history short, but essentially a group of freedom fighters, secessionists in southern states of Philippines, Mindanao, basically pledged allegiance to ISIS, took over a city, a fairly large city, about 200,000 people, and it took the Philippine National Army about a year to dislodge them. And by the end of it, they essentially just bombed the city into rubble. Couple of things that they had asked us for were small arms. And we actually, because our process is so rigorous, we essentially told them we could provide them with rifles, with scopes, with pistols. But the problem was that the release of it all took so long that the campaign was actually over by the time we said we were able to do that, which actually really annoyed the Filipinos. And the reason for that was kind of getting back to what Trey mentioned about the Leahy law. So, as I'm sure many of you are probably aware, there's been a lot of concern about the Philippines recently with President Duterte's drug enforcement laws and extrajudicial killings. And so one of the things that has been passed by Congress and has been instituted as policy across the Department of Defense, Department of State, has been a prohibition on military support for the Philippine National Police, which is largely responsible for committing a lot of the extrajudicial killings. So we will not sell, we will not train with the Philippine National Police as a result of that. And so what we had to do in terms of providing small arms support to the Philippine National Army was we had to ensure that those arms would not then be transferred to the Philippine National Police and then used to commit extrajudicial killings. So that process essentially that process was so time consuming that by the time we were ready to deliver weapons to the Philippines, the fight in Marawi was essentially over. And what they did instead is they went to the Russians and the Chinese, who have much less restrictions on, in-use monitoring, that sort of things, on how their weapons are used. And, basically the Chinese showed up with a boat full of AK-47s and said, here you go. Which I think illustrates the difference in approach of how the United States, looks at arms sales versus how some other countries do. Going back to Marawi again, though, so what we ended up doing, though, was we did provide them with what's called intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance support. So we helped them by trying to find out where, specific hotspots were within the city, where specific leaders were within the city, so that way the armed forces of the Philippines could go in and conduct surgical strikes or capture missions, so that way they wouldn't just be, sort of reliant on just trying to bomb their way to victory. Again, at the end of the day, a major problem when it comes to prosecuting, to sort of influencing a partner to prosecute a war is that despite the fact that many of them are using U.S. equipment, it's ultimately their war to prosecute. So we can influence how they do it, but we can't necessarily control them. We have levers to sort of keep them on rails, whether it's sanctions, whether it's refusal to sell further equipment, whether it's support for the equipment that they do have. But at the end of the day, it kind of goes to the Saudi Arabia problem that we currently face, is that despite the fact that they're using a lot of U.S. equipment, they're using it in very, in honestly unethical ways. And they're using it, not incorrectly, they're using munitions and all that correctly in the sense that they're bombing things. But they are not using it sort of in keeping with U.S. values, in keeping with the reasons that we provided them in the first place. And I think that's starting to have repercussions. You're seeing that in the debate that's currently going on in Congress, where both the Senate and the House are looking at ways to curtail arms sales to Saudi Arabia, which again I think is an important disciplining factor when we're thinking about how this all sort of fits together into a broader holistic strategy. Because again, it's not just necessarily, you have to remember that U.S. strategy is largely defined by the executive branch, but there are elements of Congress that can provide checks and balances on the executive and can influence strategy through the passage of laws and requirements as well. So, again, like I said, it's a very imperfect system that we have. Again, under this administration, I think the tendency has been to sell first, ask questions later, which I personally think is an incorrect approach. I think that we do need to be very, very careful about how we provide weapons abroad and make sure that we do so that are in ways that are in our interest, that are in the interests of our allies and partners, and that are used appropriately. But again, there is always sort of a balance that you need to strike between ensuring that you're able to provide the capabilities that people need, that are required to solve common problems, to solve the challenges that they face, in line with U.S. interests, in line with U.S. values, but also ensuring that there are sort of rigorous end-use monitoring, and ensuring that people aren't using weapons in the wrong ways. That question.
Yeah. Could you elaborate on how end-use agreements work?
Sure. Actually, Trey, you want to?
So with an in-use agreement, a lot of rules come with, so, we do get approval from state or in some cases from commerce. Either way, there's always going to be rules for what you can do with it. So as an interesting example, I sold you an F-15. You can't just turn around and sell that F-15. It's not totally yours. You can't turn around and sell it to somebody else unless the United States government approves that. So that's a very serious restriction on that. We made an allusion to Pakistan. Pakistan, believe it or not, those F-16s we sold to Pakistan come with a lot of restrictions on. One of them is they can only be used for counterterrorism. Okay, so if you think about what an F-16 does, and it can drop bombs, it can do air-to-air combat, it's a very versatile, capable multi-role fighter. What it's not really good at doing is counterterrorism operations, which generally are designed to be very surgical, because if you have too much collateral damage, you're going to create 10 terrorists for every one you kill. So we always try to look and try to make sure that anybody who's using our weapons, dropping our bombs, minimizes collateral damage. As Greg alluded to, in Saudi Arabia, they're not doing a very good job of minimizing collateral damage, which instead of, if you kill the right bad guy, that helps things. If you kill too many of the extended family, who oftentimes could potentially be, good people, well, you've created a whole batch more of terrorists. So yeah, lots and lots of restrictions. We talked about in-use monitoring. So that's something on the defense side. There's a program called the Blue Lantern program, which is what Commerce does. And Commerce goes out, and those guys will actually do things very, very similarly to make sure you're using things for what they're supposed to. So as an example, additionally, they're always looking for dual-use components. That's one of the big things they're looking for. So dual-use components are things that could potentially be used to eventually help make a nuclear capability or something other than their original design purpose. And that's a place where the Russians really got to us, because they got a lot of our capabilities through going through Commerce. So we didn't put quite enough restrictions on in some cases. Yeah.
I have a question about like the monitoring part. It's kind of like two parts. I heard that there's been studies that said that ISIS had United States weapons. So I'm wondering, how do you think it got into ISIS's hands? Because I have different places say different ways. And also, what do you think is the best method of end-use monitoring in order for diversion to not happen?
And so there's different thresholds for different weapons. So as someone, like I said, I've been out on the ramp and counted every single F-15 and every single AMRAAM. Why? Because those are very, very high-end capabilities. So we have when we give night vision goggles to a country, we account for every set. And we go through and do inventories on everything that they have. The problem where you get into a lot of times in places like where ISIS is at, the capabilities, are much, much less. They are oftentimes small arms. We're working with proxies, so we may be arming the Kurds, we may be arming, especially in Africa. I mean, it is very hard to tell, we like to judge ourselves as great, the ability to kind of read people, if anybody remembers, like George Bush once said, I could see in Putin's eyes that he was a good man. All right, well, I can see in his eyes where he was former KGB and still is, so we can kind of see what we want to, and we see that with a lot of these partners. So they can be your partner one day, they can shoot you in the back the next day. So especially in these kind of more Civil War areas, very, very difficult to keep track of. The Stinger missiles, those things were that was under a CIA program. So you don't have the level of monitoring that you would have under a DOD or a Department of Commerce program. So especially when you get into the CIA programs and you get into some of the special operations programs where it's things that are very small, very, very difficult to track. So that's where that occurs, is that the bar is so low that it's largely impossible to track those things. So we have to be very, very careful before we obviously enable certain partners, because they can turn on us a little bit later, which has happened.
So just to jump in on that point as well, is this is as you kind of guys are thinking about how to debate whether or not the United States should be in the business of selling small arms. One of the challenges that the United States does face is, again, as Trey mentioned, that we're really good at monitoring the big major systems that we sell for obvious reasons. They're big, they're hard to miss. I mean, like Trey said, we literally have guys that will go down to an airfield of a partner country and count the number of aircraft they have. And if one's missing, that'll start a whole chain of events to figure out why and where it's gone and what they've done with it. The challenge with with small arms, obviously, is that they can turn up. I mean, they're easy to smuggle. I mean, in the case of ISIS, again, what you end up seeing a lot, especially in Iraq, was that as ISIS sort of swept its way through and the Iraqi army retreated, they left a lot of their equipment behind, which then could just get picked up off the side. So I mean, they could then turn it into, ISIS can sell it on the black market, it can turn up wherever. So I think, and again, as Trey alluded to, in Africa, again, you have a lot of the same sort of situations where, there is fairly large amounts of corruption that can go on. So people in the military, where we've given them small arms, they can turn around and sell stuff to whoever. There's fairly, limited in-use monitoring for a lot of that kind of stuff. And what I think that really argues for is a very sort of, I would argue for, a much more restrictive policy towards especially small arms sales. Because ultimately what you'll end up doing is you'll end up destabilizing countries that are already trying to grapple with, in many cases, civil unrest, civil wars, secessionist movements, terrorism, that kind of thing. Where small arms actually are the main method of combat. The challenge is that for a lot of countries that we seek to partner with, or that we seek to help stabilize both their country, but also their regional backyard, is that that's the most pressing challenge for them. So we need to think of ways to help them address that challenge that maybe isn't by selling them, a bunch of M4s. So one of the ways that I think we can help do that is through training, education, through ISR support, again, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, so we can help them target the right people, so that way they're not, going in, kicking down doors, guns blazing, scaring people, killing the wrong people, so that way they can be much more targeted. But when it comes to actually providing the arms, and this is really one of the challenges we face, is that, the world, and especially in many hotspots, is already awash in small arms. So I think the solution for the United States is not to just provide more small arms. That's not really going to solve the problem. The solution for us, I think, and the solution for a lot of our partners that exist in these kinds of places, is really to help build their capacity in other ways where they can use stuff that they already have more effectively. And we have a lot of enabling capabilities, and we have a lot of knowledge about how to fight, counterinsurgency, because we have a lot of experience with SOF. We have a lot of experience in sort of, again, how to think about fighting the right ways so that you're minimizing collateral damage, so that you're not, just knocking down buildings left, right, and center. And so that you're fighting in, this seems somewhat oxymoronic to say, but you're fighting in essentially a humane way. Or you're fighting in a way that respects, the laws of warfare. Because again, I think that kind of goes back to a broader national interest of the United States, which is to support, a rules-based liberal international order. So if people are essentially just going off and doing whatever they want, that cuts against the notion that there is such a thing as a rules-based international order. So again, I think that as I look at this problem set, and as I was reading some of the background material that you guys had, what strikes me, the solution that strikes me is that the United States should essentially get out of the small arms sale. And I know that's not what the current administration is doing, which is a problem that I have with the current administration. I think it's a bad policy. But I think, as you guys are thinking about this, it's incumbent upon you to also think about, well, just because we think it's a bad policy or a bad idea doesn't mean that the challenges that many of these countries faces are going to go away. And there will still be a demand for these types of weapons. So then, if that's going to be the case, well then how do we help them address the challenges that they have through ways that cohere with our values, cohere with our national interests, and are not going to create additional problems down the line, or maybe not create, but minimize additional problems down the line. Because again, as I kind of mentioned earlier, this kind of goes back to the second, third order effects of actions, is that it's often very difficult to sort of know how things are going to spin off in the future. If we had a crystal ball, yeah, we probably wouldn't have sent a lot of stingers to the Central Asia area, but stuff happens.
When you asked that question earlier, one of the big things that always comes up, well, if we don't sell it to them, someone else will. And that's a very common argument that you'll hear. And certainly that's one of the reasons you saw the restrictions come off and the small arms sales kind of be emphasized largely by certain, lobbying organizations. It's like, well, if we can sell this many in the U.S. with 5% of the population, think how many we can sell worldwide. So again, without the additional controls and measures, the tendency for those to fall into the wrong hands is pretty high. I alluded, and I'll make a quick example, I alluded earlier to what does right look like versus what do we see? We use the example of Marawi. For 10 years, we had Operation Enduring Freedom Philippines. Okay, you probably heard about Operation Enduring Freedom and Operation Iraqi Freedom. You never heard about this one. Why? Because it was so successful. Okay, so this was special ops guys, largely in Mindanao in the southern part. So there's all these little islands that kind of connect Indonesia with the Philippines, and this is where Jamia Islamiyah was hanging out. So very bad terrorist organization, but we had about 500 to 600 special operators in that area. Now, guess how many doors we kicked in? Anybody?
2.
Yeah, good, you got close, man. So anyway, we kicked in 0 doors. Guess how many red dots we put on foreheads? You guys know what that's an allusion to? Yeah. So I figured you probably did. 0 red dots on foreheads, okay? So we did things a little bit differently. Everything we did was by, with, and through. It would have been very easy to go in and for us to send in a SEAL team or one of our other Army capabilities and whack a couple of guys, the wrong guys. But somebody else was just going to replace them, and many times they can be even worse, you know, and a little bit more ruthless. So we did this for 10 years. Fairly minimal cost. Obviously, we can't do this everywhere, but it was all about by, with, and through, and all about taking on those capabilities. Now, the bad news is we shut it down after 10 years. So we had a civil affairs team in Marawi. So this was the place. We knew the place that would eventually blow up. But once we kind of pulled support, they were unable to withstand things on their own. And a lot of it is that ISR capability, the ability to have good intelligence and everything else. If we were there, we'd have known it was coming. Additionally, we always had boat patrols and everything else that was out there, and they were getting in the way of all the small arms shipments and everything. So if you know there's SEAL teams out there on boats, unmarked, the odds of you transiting, you know, small arms across the Sulu Sea, they go down tremendously because you know you're probably going to get caught. You take away that, the trafficking comes back, the human trafficking comes back, the meth comes back, all that. That gives you the money to eventually have a Marawi type scenario. So we kind of know how to do this. There is what a right looks like, and it is rarely pumping more guns into the streets. So when Duterte wanted the small arms, and again, you get them, if you guys aren't going to give it to us, I'll go to somebody who will, without the red tape. And there is no red tape with the Russians, and there is no, you know, those conversations about human rights don't take very long in China or in Russia. You know, that's something that is largely, you know, something associated with Western democracies. Okay. Any other
I
questions?
think we have time for just one more, and then.
Well, he has really good questions, so we'll let him go again.
You mentioned lobbying, so I know you said that you write policy. How does lobbying play inside like selling arms? Like I know that it's done in the executive branch and like there's like professionals in the Department of Defense. Like does a request for selling arms ever happen as a result of lobbying?
Well, I would say a lot of lobbying efforts are not on the executive side nearly as much as they are on the legislative side. So a lot of times it gets down to, you know, how does it affect my district? If I've got a certain, you know, plane manufacturer or whatever, there is no doubt that those particular congressmen do have, you know, an influence. You do see a little bit of that, but by and large, the executive branch is doing everything that they can to push arms sales, again, with all those restrictions, in our interest, you know, in the interest of the partner, not disrupting, you know. So if we give a qualitative military edge to India, we're probably going to start a war with Pakistan because they're going to look at it and go, I think we can win. It's probably worth it. So we don't want to do those kind of things, as you kind of alluded to. So we have all these restrictions in place. Again, as long as we kind of follow that methodology, arms sales can be a very positive force. When you strip away that methodology, that's when, you know, it's probably the potential to go negative. And so certainly, you know, I don't think there's any doubt that the arms industry, you know, the Lockheed Martins of the world and the major suppliers do have lobbying arms that can be somewhat substantial, as do the pharmaceutical industry and everyone else. I mean, there's been studies that the biggest return on investment a company can often get is through government influence. But I would say, again, if we go through the parameters we've established, very positive. If we don't have those parameters in place, the potential for things to go negative and to have significant blowback, as we've talked about, where, but it's generally not the current administration or the current congressmen, that have to deal with these things. As you see with so many issues, mistakes that Greg is cleaning up after my generation, and you guys will be cleaning up after Grace's generation, and so we don't get everything right. I don't think anybody tries harder to get things right than we do in the United States of America. We have a great system of checks and balances. We are not perfect. We're just better than everything else that's ever come along. So, always remember that when you think about, anyway, we've still got room to grow. And if anybody has any quick questions about, military service and what that looks like, it is a great way to develop skill sets and character that is highly coveted, not only in the military, but also by U.S. industry.
Great. All right. Thank you so much to Trey and Greg. Great. Well, thank you all for all the wonderful questions and staying engaged throughout the entire discussion. You're going to stay in this room, and I think David will be coming over and giving you a lecture. So if you just hold tight for a few minutes.
All right. Dude, you got all the good questions, man.
I'm not going to have I'm just suspended. I'll just get somewhere that I need to have like I just left it in your mind. I'm not going to have but then I have this one.
I don't do it. It's just, it probably was stress. But no, it all happened
We'll ignore all those things now. The difference is that on the ground, still have to follow along.
because you're looking at it, you're turning me up. Why are you really why are you surprised?
What's surprise?
What's that in a lot of ways? Why are you? Why are you?
Most people who need to interpret the Constitution, Attorney General,
I don't understand what's here.
we will have some blowback. We clean up a lot of messes, but we make a few messes.
What's the best one? Nope. Pretty good.
Ernest? Yeah, pleasure. Great question. That's always a good sign. So you got a few good answers. So. All right, take care, man.
You did it like 20 miles per hour, like at least slow down. It's like TV.
I said it's going.
I told you I forgot that.
Oh, I mentioned the military. Go Air Force. If you're questioning anything, your quality of life will be much better, and you can have more impact.
The question I asked.
I mean, also there's that normal have to go over each other for the drone. They don't probably they don't find that's the whole question. I know. Exactly. And I'll extend yours.
But I don't.
That immigration creates this
Oh no, that's way too much.
I looked for you. For the last one, you can talk somewhere.
I heard it like 3 years ago, but you know.
Fine. I have bad memory. I can't remember yesterday. Okay,
Did we ever turn this off?
The thing is, you can write down what she got